right, everyone. Hello and welcome back to the Shaft podcast. Today's episode of the Beer Parlor Conversations. And I was actually discussing with our guest this morning about how this is a full circle moment because, like, just last month we turned 3 years, and he was our very first guest when we were babies, and no one believed in us. He was the only one who believed and supported us. So today's episode almost feels like a full circle moment. Um, but back then he was a sports lawyer, and he still is today. So hopefully we are getting like 3 extra years of experience and knowledge, which he's about to share on today's podcast. And especially for today's topic also, where we'll be discussing football finances. What does it mean? Like when you hear FFP, when you hear UEFA rules or certain teams being banned, what exactly is going on? So we want to unravel the entire conversation and make sure that you have the full understanding of it. So without wasting too much time, I would like to present today's guest, sports lawyer personality, a big time Man United fan, and I hope we don't get to talk about Man United too much. Faithfulness, Faithfulness, welcome to today's platform.
Yeah, bro, I'm really excited to hear. I'm sure I exuded that excitement in our conversations, building up on text. I was sat here ready, and I'm really proud of what you guys have done over the years. I knew that, like, you guys, because I know the passion that you guys have, you and Andrews, and I knew that this was certainly something that was going to be as big. But like I told you earlier on, I didn't expect it to be this big because when I looked at how many subscribers you guys have now, I was amazed. And that's absolutely because of the dedication that you guys have displayed and the consistency, most importantly, because consistency, I think, is what excellence is easy to find, but consistency is not. So credit to you guys, and I am incredibly excited to be back here also discussing this topic, something that I've become very interested in, very passionate about, because it's within the spectrum of my profession, but also because I'm a football fan who loves, the extra layer and the behind the scenes, if you want. So I hope we have a conversation that will excite the listeners, and yeah, we'll see how it goes.
No, I absolutely am also looking forward to this conversation. Like mostly because like even for myself coming into the conversation around football finances, it seems the rules tend to be quite different, and it looks like it requires a different kind of lens as a football fan. Like if you're a football fan, you're following your team, there are some things which you wanted to do. And for long, there's been discussion in terms of the split between who the fan is and their interests, and then the business owners and their interests, and how they sort of like look in different ways. But more so, the conversation is tethering towards fans wanting to understand the business side and have the business interests as much as possible, and business owners also getting very, very passionate. So I'm sure we're going to come into all of those details. But I want you to set the ground for us in terms of being a football fan. Why is it important that we understand the finances of our clubs and understand the financial landscape in which our clubs are in?
Okay, so I mean, I will just basically give an overview of what to expect from the competition and how I perceive football finance generally. Depending on who you ask, the story of football swings between doom and gloom on one side and something that is altogether more uplifting, something almost heavenly for some people. And if you understand the history of football, it sheds some light into this beautiful metamorphosis, because football is a game that was born in the smoke of, and the smoke and the struggle of industrial Britain, a real working class invention. There's a movie on Netflix that gives a picture of the history of football, and you can see that it is a real working class invention. It was shaped by factory shifts, it was shaped by church halls, and was shaped by communal ideals, the ideals of community. So in essence, football was a pastime for the working class. And
Yeah.
then you see that game, that pastime working class has now morphed over time into a multi-billion-dollar business that now involves sovereign wealth, that now involves private equity and now involves hedge funds. And you then realize that the level of legislative sophistication that is required to deal with that bloom, and the dynamism that has been introduced is very, very high. And but also, if you this is the beautiful side of things, the uplifting side of things. But if you look at football through different lenses, there is more skepticism around the business model. And some people will tell you that football is bad business, and for good reason. Why? Because revenue is volatile. You have revenue from where? Um, from either getting into Europe or getting relegated. So the spectrum is never the same. Like Man United's finances, Man United, for example, is more of a stable entity, more of a successful commercial entity. So, okay, the finances do not really oscillate as much. But for the average club, the revenue in 1 year where you make Europe, of course, is drastically different from the revenue in a year where you get relegated. And this is not normal in orthodox or mainstream business. There is more stability, there's more predictability.
Yeah.
TV money is also relatively static. You get the TV deals every 3 years. And then revenue growth, which is something that all business people love to speak about, is something that has a ceiling. You live in the UK and you know that ticket prices never are regulated. Sometimes most schools out of goodwill freeze ticket prices for years. So there's a cap there. Expansion is also not very possible because to expand, you need to build a new stadium, you need to remodel your stadium, and that is something that becomes very, very problematic. And then the two most reliable assets, the biggest assets of a football entity, are structurally illiquid because the two biggest assets are the players and the stadium. So that's not something you can rely on consistently to as something that will give you profit, because like there are lots of variables that are involved. And then it's now a game that is cash heavy. Costs keep rising, because you can describe the football or the sports ecosystem as a winner takes all, spectrum. When you think about the winners, it doesn't have to be one winner, but if it's in the Champions League, if you're talking about the league, for example, the top 4 teams are the winners and they take all, and so then it means that you have to spend to keep up. You have to spend not to be relegated. And that means that, transfers become more expensive because the stakes are high. And when the transfer is expensive, if you sign a player for 80, 90 million and the player flops like Darwin Núñez, you go to the market to replace him. And the team you're going to speak to says you paid 85 million for a player our player is better. So we charge you around that or even more. And then, of course, players are listening and are seeing that you're willing to pay 80 million for me, so you should pay me 200K as wages. And then, of course, agents also have an interest in the wages being high because they get a commission from there, so it drives up the prices. So you then have an ecosystem where cash flow is required. Who is going to give you cash? Banks won't, because the banks know that is bad business because your two biggest assets are illiquid. So then I understand when people say football is bad business. And I understand when you look at the game as in the historical lenses and you see how it has morphed into this great empire that has all these interests. So the fan is then now because of the growth, because of the interest that we have from football, because of also the fact that football has also grown dramatically. Premier League is as rich as is the richest it's ever been. Now,
World, right?
the fans have to be protected, and I think we are going to get into that. That's the real juice. The fans have to be protected, and that's why the rules have been created. But then the fans see sometimes that the rules can be restricting, can restrain that clubs can do, can limit the possibilities that they have. And that means that since the financial side now heavily influences the footballing side, the product on the pitch, fans naturally have to be interested. I don't think there's ever been a time where fans have been more abreast with the full dimension or the full spectrum of the regulatory framework. And that is why, for example, we can have a podcast discussing finance and be confident that we'll be interested in listening. So it's been a very interesting journey to get to this point.
No, I think it's incredible in the way you describe it, because you talk about how it grows from it being a social event to now it being a full-fledged business enterprise. And for and we'll start talking about some of the American owners right now, right? Because like much later in the podcast, because there's concerns that the way in which the game has grown within England and the way in which sports grew in America is very different. And the perception has always been that within England, there's more of a social, it's more social heavy in terms of prioritizing the enjoyment of people. And I think people have toyed with ideas such as wage caps, limiting sponsorships, like ownership models. Like even in Europe in general, like I think that's sort of like the sentiment that's there. Like if you look at it culturally, so for example, in Germany, where they have a model that prioritizes community. So I guess there is sort of like a philosophical question as to if this, and I know you mentioned the need for the wages and all of these things, but in an ideal world, would we want less of finances being a motivating factor for football? And or do you think that this level of progression in finance is one that is inevitable, or one that may still be beneficial when it comes to growing the sport? And I'm looking at it especially because now football is a global thing and you need to compete on a global stage too.
So at the end of the day, I gave I gave a very murky overview of football finances. So I think the listener might be asking, so why the hell do people invest in football? And people invest because it is cheap to invest in football. You buy a club for relatively cheap, what, $20 million, and the possibilities are so immense. If you buy a club, like you see what's happening with Wrexham, you can gain promotion because you can outspend the clubs in the fourth tier, the fifth tier,
Yeah,
and spend them. There's risk involved, but it has a relatively low barrier of entry. So you get in there, and the possibilities are so broad. Football is quite popular, so branding is always going to be huge. And if you're a business person outside of football, the commercial opportunities are so immense when you're dealing with the branding that is involved. So it's inevitable, as you say, that football grows since the entry level is cheap, the barrier is quite low, and you can enter, and the possibilities are quite immense because you have to burn a lot of cash. But if you're, like I said, a hedge fund, if you have any real interest in advertising, like the possibilities are just so great because almost everyone is interested
yeah,
in footballing business. So I don't think that we will live in a world that is so removed from in a football ecosystem that is so removed from financial considerations. I think that the authorities at this point cannot do anything about it. Like the Premier League, for example, the FA cannot do anything because you cannot regulate who owns what. If the PL, the Premier League or the FA had that kind of power, somebody like Evangelus, the Nottingham Forest owner, will probably not own a football club. So you see that this is a game. Like the best that the authorities can do is to create a framework to protect. But the problem
uh,
sometimes that protection can be very, very inimical to
uh,
the teams being able to create a very entertaining product. And you see that La Liga is suffering, because
yeah,
the league is trying to protect. It's quite hands-on. It's dictating the finances and the barriers that clubs that have to function within, and that affects the product to a great extent. So to answer the question directly, I don't think that there is much that can be done. I don't think that there is much that can change. I think this is the world that we are going to live in, and we have to find a way to figure out how we can make the best of it.
no, like I absolutely agree. I think that the case of La Liga is very interesting. I do hope we have the time to sort of like cover it in detail. But I want us to start talking about some of these financial innovations which you speak about some of these ring fencing, which some of the leagues have started to do, because we hear a lot of terms being thrown around: FFP, PSR, independent football regulator, but without a clear understanding of what those things mean. But also, in answering the question, I would love for you to give some context as to the current landscape of football and why some financial inventions are even suggested or put forward in the first place.
All right. So, I mean, the first thing that everyone knows about, or the biggest buzzword before PSR, was FFP. So,
Yes.
why was FFP introduced? I think that's a good place to start. And FFP was introduced because in the early 2000s, there was, an influx of capital into football. UEFA expanded, more teams had money, and then logically there was a transfer boom, and then there was an implosion that followed. A perfect time capsule of this implosion is the 2001 Champions League semi-final between Valencia and Leeds United. So these two teams were at the peak of their powers. Valencia had spent a lot of money. Leeds United too had spent a lot of money, and they were in the Champions League semi-final. So two of the four biggest teams. What happened after that, I think, tells the story. Because there was so much money Leeds kept on spending. I think Leeds paid the highest transfer fee for a defender when they signed Leo Ferdinand. So it gives you a picture. So they do that. They're in the UCL Champions League. 3 years later, they get relegated, and then it takes 16 years for them to come back to the first division. Valencia win the league in 2002, and then I think in 2005 or six. But after that, it's a downward spiral. All their fortunes go on that downward spiral, and it's a complete nosedive. Different reality. So then you see that the risk taking caught up with these two clubs. And when we speak about Valencia today, and we speak about Leeds United today, it's a direct contrast to what they were. And so the authorities looked at that and said, how do we prevent this from happening? So I think around 2011, the FFP rule came about. And the crux of the FFP was the break-even rule that basically said in the period of 3 years, in a 3-year rolling period, you have to break even. You don't necessarily have to make profits, but you have to make your revenue and your expenses have to align. And it was a 3-year rolling period. So yeah, you can lose in 1 or 2 years, but in the third year, maybe you have to balance it out and make a profit. So that was something that of course, made teams to change their approaches to focus more on sustainable expenditures, not to spend more than what they have. And I think the FFP has been quite successful, but that form in which it existed no longer exists. I think there have been some changes to the FFP. Now, the way the FFP is that there is still the break-even principle, but but what happens now is you are allowed to lose some money. You're allowed to lose 60 million over 3 years, 60 million euros over 3 years, and up to 90 million if your owner covers the extra 30 million. So if there is an injection of capital in that period, you're allowed to lose. So it's a little bit more favorable, but there remains also a 70% cap in spending, which is for me reasonable. Like 70% of the income you made should be spent on wages and amortization, the transfer fee payment. Like there were clubs, for example, who spent 110%, 100%, 110%. So even getting into debt to pay wages. So like living way above their means, and that is not sustainable. And what happens is that after a while, the owners run away, after putting the club in that kind of mess. So the rules are logical, and now I think the rules allow some wiggle room and say, okay, you can lose. Previously, you couldn't lose, but seeing the new realities within the footballing world. Now teams are allowed to lose, but it's a rolling period. It's 3 years, 60 million. Most clubs lose money, right?
Yeah.
19 of the 20 Premier League teams the last two years have lost money. I think Tottenham is the only profitable Premier League. Tottenham, ironically, is the most profitable Premier League in history, right? So, I mean, revenue, of course, they don't match. Revenue-wise, they don't match Man United and Chelsea and City, but in terms of profitability, they are well run. So that kind of also tells you, the story that many clubs lose money. So UEFA says you can lose money. However, this is a cap, and if you
Mm.
cannot keep it within that cap, there are fines. You can be kicked out of the Champions League. You can be fined heavily, like Chelsea was. And so, I mean, Premier League PSR then is kind of an offshoot of the FFP because prior to um, the PSL, most teams complied with the FFP in the hopes that they will be in the Champions League. Because if you're not in the Champions League, then like you're not protected by FFP, and you can do some things. But the teams that were in the running for the Champions League were also the teams that had the capacity to exceed, that cap very, very outrageously. The teams in the seventh to 12th wouldn't spend and go so like overboard anyways, like because it was just logical. The Premier League had some kind of regulations, but the Premier League in 2013 followed through by creating the PSL, the profit and sustainability rules, and basically it says you can lose 105 million over a 3-year rolling period. But of course, with exceptions of investments made into the academy, into women's football and infrastructure, which is a reasonable compromise to make. So within PSL, there are lots of dimensions. There are lots of things. I mean, I can go on, but maybe you might want to handle the structure of the questions.
No, I think it's very interesting because, like, when you hear some of these terms thrown around, it just does feel like, uh, from a fan's perspective, that the clubs have money to spend, they should be allowed to spend. And I think there are some conceptions around certain clubs being allowed to spend and then your club not being allowed to spend. And where it can get really confusing. I wanted us to go into some of these scenarios because these rules have been put in place. But why are we seeing clubs like Chelsea, Aston Villa receive a lot of fines, while certain clubs like Man City can still spend a bit more? I think Man City is a very, very curious case, and we are going to dovetail into that soon. But
Yeah.
from a fan's perspective, how do we explain some of these reactions, some of these fines, which we've begun to see within the ecosystem?
So first of all, like Chelsea and Aston Villa being fined recently by UEFA is proof that there is a difference between FFP and PSR. So PSR allows you to lose 105 million, meaning that if you lose 105 million over a 3-year rolling period, you are within the rules, legitimately. However, FFP says you can lose only a max of 60 million if there is no influx of money, you know. So that means that you can be PSR compliant and you can be FFP defiant. And
Yeah.
I think that fans have to understand, first of all, in terms of spending, the rules are clear. You can spend as high as you want if you have made enough money. And you look at Liverpool, for example, Liverpool
Yeah.
last summer didn't spend any money and they won the champion. They won the Premier League. I think they got around 160 million from that. They got to the round of 16 in the Champions League and also got a crazy amount of money from that. The previous transfer window's budget was transferred to this current season, so that logically allows them to spend um, over 300 million very easily. But for a team like that, and then the most important thing is that the wage structure is reasonable, right? Because
Yeah.
counts, what counts really is amortization and the wages. So amortization basically for the viewers who do not understand is that it's simple. Like you sign a player on a 5-year contract for 50 million.
Mm.
That 50 million is amortized to 5 years to the length of the contract. So that means that the book value of the player in that in each given year is 10 million. In the first year, the book value will be around like 10 million. The book value will be
Mm.
50 million. But in the third year, the book value will be what remains to be paid based on the length
Mm.
of the contract. So in the first year, you pay 10 million. The second year, you
Yeah.
pay 20 million of the player's transfer fee. In the third year, you've paid 30 million. So what remains is 20 million. So the player's book value at that point will be 20 million. So if you sell the
Mm.
player for 25 million, I mean, the wages are also calculated. So let's say the wages are 2 million, 5 million. You sell the player at 30 million, it's PSL profit. However, it's not
Mm.
profit in the real business sense because it's PSL profit because of amortization and what remains. But the player, let's say the player was signed for 50 million and is a flop, and then you have to sell him for 30 million lesser than you bought him. Like so, that's why there is a problem in a sense. That there is a dimension of PSL compliance and accountants within football have this conundrum, but
Mm.
they're quite equipped for it because you have to think about PSL profit and compliance. Then you have to think about UEFA FFP compliance. Then you have to think about profit for your shareholders. So yes, we sold this player above his book value and we made a PSL profit, but are your shareholders happy about that transfer because you lost money on him? For example, if Man United signed Hoyland for 64 million, so his book value is around 16 million, 15 million a year. If we sell Hoyland today for 50 million, it will count as PSL profit, but the team
Yeah.
has lost. So basically, every year, PSL looks at the table, the players' transfer value. There's some players who, okay, over time you've paid the transfer fee over. So Van Dijk, for example, was signed for 75 million, which was a record at the time. Like by now, Liverpool has paid off his entire value. So what Van Dijk costs every year is just his wages. So
Yes.
if it's on 10 million a year, okay, 9 million a year, good. But for example, they have just signed Florian Ritz, and he book value will be more than Van Dijk's book value. Like so, let's say
Mm.
for this year, Liverpool has to pay. Like he was signed for 116 million, like, and then you're paying that over 5 years. So let's say 20 million a year plus his wages 10 million. So his book value will be like 30 million. Van Dijk's book
Yes.
value, for example, even though he's probably a bigger player, will be lesser because like Van Dijk, costs around 10 million, like by the book. So then that's why academy players are loved. Like
Yes.
that's how loved academy players. Like they are
Yeah.
no value. Like there's no book value in any sense. Like the players'
Yeah.
fees are not necessarily factored in. So if you sell an academy player, like it's pure profit.
Pure
Prime.
profit. That's the word, right?
Yes. So that is basically how it works. So basically, if you calculate Van Dijk's book value plus Salah's book value plus Ferran's book value plus Gakpo's book value, and that amount is more than 70% of the club's revenues. Then
Mm.
problem. So fans have to think if you calculate if Liverpool made 200 million and Liverpool is spending 199 million on the players' wages plus the amortized transfer fees, is that a sensible way to run a football club? And that's why Villa suffers because Villa doesn't make lots of revenue, but they have players on high wages. I think Villa's wage bill was around 80% of the revenue that was coming in. That is not a sustainable way to run a business. And that's why Chelsea's genius is spreading that cost across 8 years instead of five, the standard. So now the player costs 50 million. and then it's a 5-year contract. Um, and if a player costs 50 million and it's a 5-year contract, the amortized value is 10 million. If
Million, yeah,
8-year contract, that cost is maybe 7 million. I'm not great at
yeah,
math, maybe 7 million. So you save yourself around 3 million, 4 million, like a year by spreading that cost. There's a risk with that, but you look at PSR and outmaneuvering it means just extending and stretching out, the value of the contract. So basically, Chelsea has players that are earning a lot, but they have to pay for them over a longer period, and that
time,
makes more favorable because there's that elasticity that they have. So that's just basically what PSR is about. And you see, when you understand how simple and straightforward it is, you can understand why it's easy, like for Chelsea, for example, to outmaneuver it, because some of it is
yeah.
good faith. The rules basically require good faith. But I feel like Chelsea didn't approach the rules with good faith, and they have no reason to. Like they're like, yes, it's like let's try that.
No, yeah, I was going to come to that conversation in terms of how you see it changing the landscape and the behaviors of some of these clubs. For example, when you start talking about Liverpool and the kind of transfers they're beginning to do, this is not Liverpool at all. This is not. This is something that Jurgen Klopp will see, and he might just turn in his Red Bull Leipzig grave or whatever. But you also look at what Man City is doing right now, where they refuse to phase out their old squad. And then between the last January transfer window and this window, the number of players that they've signed also for big fees, like Nico Gonzalez was signed for 60 million. And this summer, they want to give him away for free. And you look at what Chelsea is doing, and people keep talking about it. I think even Chelsea at a point in time had to sell their hotel and women's team to themselves. And you hear some of these stories about how clubs are adapting. For me, I wanted to ask, how do you see club behavior change over this period, given the rules that are coming in? Do you also think that some of these practices would be clamped down on by the Premier League and also by UEFA? You would expect that something like that would happen, right? And
Sorry, go.
yeah, no. That's the end of the question. You can come in now. Yeah.
There's something called related party transactions. That's what Chelsea did with the hotels and with the academy. Those are related parties, and the profit that they make in a way counts to Chelsea. UEFA is stricter on those things. So what
Mm,
Chelsea did there with the academy and with the women's team is like under UEFA's rule, it doesn't work. You know, that's partly why they've been fined or they've exposed themselves to more fines. But I'm sure Chelsea's lawyers and accountants are smart and will know how to figure that out. But that's important. UEFA is stricter than the PSR is, and clubs have to know that. So you cannot mess around and say, "Oh, we sold car parts," and UEFA is going to say that's bullshit. That's the first part. The second part, and the reason why it's difficult in the Premier League to effect change is that for anything to pass, the Premier League has a board, of course, and the board makes some important decisions. But the clubs have so much power. For anything to pass in any decision to most decisions that are made have to have a vote of 14 clubs in favor.
yes.
So the conversation, for example, came up in the Premier League board after Chelsea's maneuvering of the rules, and it was up for vote for a vote, and they said, should we ban this loophole of selling your academy and selling your car parks
Let me guess the response.
every month?
No.
It's logical. It's a zero sum game. Like they have made the move, gained from it. We would like that get out of jail card if push comes to shove. And we saw Aston Villa, like 3-4 months later, do the same thing by selling their academy to themselves. So I remember we were speaking on the same WhatsApp group, and I said, well, it's smart for Chelsea to do this, but I feel like PSL favors has locked in the existing elite. So any loophole that exists, I feel, favors a team outside of that elite group that exists. But still, like clubs are going to learn from other clubs taking risks, and will, of course, want to explore those possibilities for themselves. And that's going to happen. So I think that there will be that adaptation. Clubs are not, especially with the thinking. So when you have the biggest challenge, I wouldn't say it's a challenge, but the most interesting aspect of the Premier League right now is the diversity of the ownership group. You have Evangelos, um, who is a cutthroat businessman
Yeah.
has dabbled into
Like I was reading the article that you sent onto the page. Like that stuff is gory. That stuff is gory, and it sort of like gave me Roman Abramovich vibes, but also
on
in the sense that Roman Abramovich was
steroids.
kept,
Yeah.
yeah, but like
So
guys,
Evangelos
oh God.
Renakis is somebody like who is basically a criminal. I mean, like what it looks like is a criminal who is just so powerful and will not be will not face any punishment or any repercussions for it. And that's something that everyone has to just pretend like, yeah, oh, it's all good, it's all fine. Like that's what is happening. So you have somebody like that. So imagine like a Premier League board, you have Evangelos um, Marinakis on the board. You have American owners, their own approach to like Luco, for example, is cutthroat, is business, is different, is is interesting. And then you have the traditional UK owners um, that are there who are UK businessmen who see things more like the more black and white, more of a fettered, straight jacketed way. So that means that you have a conflict of ideas and ideals, and if you want to get, and then of course you have sovereign wealth. You have Saudi with the Saudi Public Investment Fund. You have Sheikh Mansour with City. So you have all kinds of like there's private equity, like I said, there are hedge funds, they're involved. So everybody now has, but the bottom line is then that if you take an action that benefits you, no one is going to vote for that action to be outlawed until they reap the benefits from it. So maybe the only way you can have those loopholes blocked is if you say everybody can do this once. Once there's a loophole, it's discovered, everybody has one get out of jail card, and then that loophole will be. So that's how I see it. That
Yeah,
iterating and adapting, but they will never outrightly just close any loopholes that they haven't benefited from.
yeah, because these clubs are also smart, right? Like especially if you look at the kind of money that's coming to football, and especially also from, I don't know if this is the right term to use, or from a jurisprudence perspective, where this is a new landscape or this is a new area, the ability to find those kind of loopholes and some of these smart lawyers and accountants, it would always exist, which would mean that UEFA and some of the governing bodies would need to consistently adapt. And this is where I want to move the next set of questions, because how strong these institutions in being able to lock down the laws and enforce them, because we'll talk about Man City very, very soon, because it does look like this it's the change in the ownership structure which has prompted a lot of these clubs to move in this way. And actually, let's talk about that, because when you describe the history of the football in UK, where it was more community-based ownership and like businessmen from the local communities picking it up, and it was a passion project when they supported it. The introduction of Roman Abramovich somewhere in the 2000s, which made Chelsea successful, moving from down the table up to the top, and everyone didn't like it. Till today, people don't appreciate it. Then you saw Man City come in and even crank it up and do that times 10. And today they've established themselves as a hegemony within football. Then you saw the Saudis come in, and then all of a sudden this new wave of regulations which has come in. So I want to understand the interactions between these new forms of fair Is it why aren't these bodies allowed to also act in the same way? And because, for example, Newcastle fans will complain that Chelsea benefited, Man City benefited, but we can't spend our money. Is it fair to start limiting the clubs in this way?
So I think first of all, like you have rightly insinuated, PSL has locked in the existing elite, and I think that's one of the biggest criticisms of PSL. Um, in 2002 or thereabout, 2001, 2002, Blackburn had an owner that was very charismatic, that invested very heavily, and I think they won the league, if I'm not mistaken, between 1999 and 2003. I think they won the league because they had an owner that came in and blew everyone, blew the competition out of the water. And then, of course, like you said, you had Roman coming, and then you had um, Sheikh Mansour coming. The biggest question that I asked myself was, would would Abramovich have succeeded in this new PSL climb? Would Sheikh Mansour have succeeded in this new climb? And the answer is an emphatic no, because we see what is happening with Newcastle. I think the Saudi investment fund is they're the richest owners in the Premier League, but their hands are tied and the possibilities are quite limited. You can argue that the club being domiciled in Newcastle has affected some transfers because Newcastle is not the most delightful place to live compared to Man City, to London, to Manchester, and then London, where the big clubs exist. But under PSL, you cannot just do crazy things, first of all. Secondly, there were some rules, and there was even, like you can see, PSL during the period of Manchester City's dominance. And during that period, they did a lot to bend the rules, and they did lots of crazy stuff. An example is that Roberto Mancini was paid $2 million for 4 days of work in Abu Dhabi every summer. $2 million for 4 days of work, and he received an additional 2 million for his salary. So in the books, he was paid 2 million, but he received an additional $2 million. So there was lots of fabrication of documents, um, claiming that money came from sponsors when they came from the owners, and that's why City faced 115 charges. So the reality is that the rules have changed and the rules have curbed lots of things that we saw. Is that fair? You can argue that it's unfair. If City was in a mess right now, or Chelsea was in the pits, then you would have said, "Oh, look, we did this to prevent the team." If, for example, like the only the case studies are Valencia and Leeds, you can say, yeah, if we didn't stop these, teams would have ended up like Leeds United and like Valencia, struggling and getting relegated or becoming mediocre. But when you see the success of Chelsea and the success of City, you can't help but think that if the Saudi PIF is allowed, they can create a juggernaut out of nothing. And that is that's quite unfortunate, and most owners are limited. But then, is it healthy? Are the PSL rules healthy? Are they sustainable? Are they sensible? I think yes. Because you shouldn't, even though Chelsea has succeeded, even though City has succeeded, I think most teams utilizing that strategy will fail over time. So Newcastle has achieved some great success, like, but they would have wanted that to happen faster. If Newcastle continues, and maybe like it does help the fans without them knowing, because now for Newcastle to be turned into a juggernaut, you have to continue investing over a 10-year period.
Yes.
As of to Roman Abramovich that to make those wholesale changes over a 5-year period and instantly turn them to they were a very um, colossal figure in the Premier League. So I think the incentive now is to carry out more sustained investment, is to be more shrewd, is to be smarter, is to be more tactful in your investment. And personally, I like that, you know. But I can, if you know, Newcastle and other clubs who would love, to invest, cannot deal with the realities that have displayed themselves.
No, like 100%. Like let's deal or let's delve into the 115 charges right now, because like just from the example that you gave, and I did hear that there were some leaked emails, which is the basis of this indictment anyway. It does look like it's not just a smoking gun. Like we've literally caught the entire place on fire. So why is it that for I think there was an initial case which went on and Man City still won, and currently we know that the Premier League is investigating, but from all that we hear, City is quite confident that they are going to win the lawsuits. And we can talk about the implications of them losing or not, but we want to give the listeners a bit more context into what are some of these 115 charges, where do they come from in the first place, and why are we looking to indict City?
So I think the kernel there is, just inflated um, sponsorship sponsorships, inflated sponsorship costs, if you want. And if you bring a coach, if you're a club and your revenue does not allow you to, for example, Burnley, based on their revenue, cannot employ Jose Mourinho. It's a huge cut. What happens is then that, imagine that Burnley says, "Oh, Jose, come," and then they write that Jose is earning 800,000 um, a year, which is quite looks spurious. And then then the owner says, "Please tutor my child in coaching for 2 weeks," and then pays him 10 million for that. It's compliant, but it's quite fishy, and so City did that with Roberto Mancini. City did that with the sponsors, and I think the bulk of the charges also are, like it's basically corporate fraud, and that's that the case is dragging out. But a lot of it was also the refusal, the refusal to cooperate with the authorities. I think made more than 20 of those charges are instances where they refuse to report or refuse to cooperate with what the authorities demanded. So the charges are quite indicting. Now, I mean, fans, of course, will be wondering why it has taken so long. There was indeed a case. There was indeed a case between City and the Premier League. I wouldn't say that case was a precursor to this, and depending on how you look at it, um, both parties say they won that case. I cannot really remember the gist of it, but I know that the Premier League released a presser saying that they're happy with the result, and then City came and tried to frame it as a victory. Typically, in those rulings, if you read football rulings, there are always opinions. You know, legal opinions that are given. There's also the ruling that is given, and the ruling can be so expansive and elaborate, and the ruling has to interpret certain things, has to define certain things, and some definitions can go your way, some definitions can go the other person's way. So I don't think that case is really one that you can point to and say, okay, yeah, like this is it. The current case is quite important, and the reason why the case is taking so long is that, but if you look at the two examples of the most recent cases, first of all, Everton and Nottingham Forest. The Everton case was one violation over a period of 3 years.
Mhm.
Just one violation, 3 year period, thereabout. There were, from what I learned, there were around 50,000 pieces of evidence exchanged. So just one violation, 3 year period. So with Man City's case, you have 9 years, and you're alleging corporate fraud. You're alleging more serious factors. So you could easily have more than 500,000 pieces of evidence to look through. Into. That's why there has to be meticulous. Then you have three people, the independent commission reviewing the case, and those three people are high profile. They are busy, so they are not going to dedicate themselves only to this case. And City came out all guns blazing, opposing these charges, fighting these charges, unlike Everton. Everton appealed, but there was more of, we did this, but we didn't do this. With Nottingham Forest, they basically Nottingham Forest even basically admitted and said, yeah, like, we just tried to, we just, yeah, we tried to hold out and sell Brendan Johnson in July instead of June, and that's because PSL the accounting year under PSL ends June 30th, so they sold Johnson, I think, in July, if I remember correctly, and that meant that the profit went into the new accounting year and not the previous year, and therefore they were in breach of the PSL demand. So City has come out, it's come out. Moving. They're like, yeah, we didn't do this, and they're the best lawyers. And if I know anything about lawyers, will end their money. It's going to be very. I mean, the case is basically done now. The independent commission is reviewing, but yeah, you have to review over 500k pieces of evidence. You have to also earn your money for your family, for your daily livelihood, because you have other cases to involve. So I think we will eventually get the decision as to what the outcomes will be. I think it's hard to really.
You'd imagine there will be some title stripping if City is found guilty.
Yes, I think that's also something that is quite scary for the independent commission, if I can say that, because it's not just about the titles that you strip. Because, for example, you strip them of the title. Do you then remove them out of the equation completely? Because it's not just going to be the title. There was probably 70 million pounds that was up for grabs for the Champions League spot that they also took that year. Which, if they are removed from, the team that is beneath them climbs up, and everybody climbs up and climbs up and climbs up. So everybody then becomes entitled to an extra 30 million, an extra 50 million. We saw what happened with Aston Villa against. I think Aston Villa's benefited from a, a dysfunctional moment in the goal line technology and promoted, and they had to settle the case out of court because the team that was relegated came out and said, well, we could have gotten this amount of money. So basically, they had to split in some way the Premier League earnings between themselves. So that's what people are asking. What then happens if City is found in breach? What do you do? Who is going to sacrifice? Is the title stripped? Or are you going to look at because real justice will demand that everything is corrected.
Yes.
From what we know, and I'm biased to an extent, but the facts are the facts. Like, if you got a coach that was above your means and you did fabricated stuff, it means that you cheated. And if you cheated, who are the victims? Is the victim only the team that lost out on the title, or is the victim also the team that finished third, who could have finished and would have earned some money? So that's where so I imagine, and many pundits I've listened to imagine, that there will be an announcement of the verdict, and the commission might take 2 weeks to 1 month, 2 months to figure out what the adequate punishment will be. It's also possible that they could be found not guilty, but I don't think they can be found not guilty of all the 115 charges.
Yeah.
But it's possible that they could be found not guilty, in which case the legal fees involved here, from what I hear, are in excess of 100 million.
It's crazy. I want, because this, when you mentioned the team of lawyers from City, I wanted to also ask this. When we see this a lot within the regulatory space, right, where there is a state agency, small budget, but taking on like huge corporations, what would you say is the capacity of the Premier League? I know for UEFA, they seem to have some money, But looking at the new crop of owners who are coming, some of these rich private equity firms, these rich Americans and other billionaires, what would it do for some of the intentions to regulate, especially in context of the City case, especially if they are likely to lose and not get anything out of City? What would be the implication for the space?